This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board, and again, I hope you've had a great week. I've just come back off of a 5-day field research using the Burrow RX, and turns out I've learned that it's an earlier version of the Burrow RX, so I did not know they came out with looked like a bigger engine. So I was working with, I believe it was the 4 horsepower, maybe the 4.5 horsepower, and I visited with some people that were wanting to learn a little bit more about the device, and they owned one, and it ended up theirs was, I think, a 6.5 horsepower engine, and it had some different configurations to it, so I have definitely got to check that out and contact the manufacturer and say, hey, what have you done here with the machine and what changes are made? So, but anyways, I was researching, trying to figure out what the injection time needed to be for Colombian ground squirrels. And yeah, what an experience it was. And my suspicion is I don't really have any real contact with California ground squirrels. But in terms of the burrowing, and to my limited understanding, it looks like Colombians act a whole lot like California ground squirrels. So it looked like a moonscape in parts of that field, and felt bad for the producer. But I was really grateful for him giving me permission to get out there and do that. But anyways, enough about me, and I hope you've had, again, a great week, a profitable week, a safe week. And last time we were together, I talked about roof rats and their biology and some identification issues and what they're doing. And this week, I wanted to move on to control methods and sort of give a little survey of some control issues. Again, nothing earth-shaking here, although I think I've got one tip from some of the literature that certainly intrigued me, and perhaps those of you out in the field looking for just something different. Maybe this would be something useful for you to include in your own business, particularly for those of you. And again, I understand it's a minority of you that are dealing with roof rats. Maybe something that you can use that would help be targeting those roof rats better without poisoning other non-target animals, which of course is, I hope, a goal every professional wildlife control operator and pest control or pest management professional should be doing. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. Give us a great rating. We'd appreciate that. Also visit us on the Facebook page, Pest Geek Podcast on the Facebook, and join the revolution, as Frank calls it. We'd be glad to join with you and dialogue and share ideas and work together to provide the important service that you give the public, and which is unfortunately underappreciated in so many different ways. So all right, well, I'm here at my homepage on my website. There's just some publications that I write. And of course, I'm always looking for people who are interested in being on the show, perhaps doing an interview. I do have some interviews coming up, but certainly I am more than welcome to interview people if you have something that you'd like to share to a wider audience. Love to hear it. I'm always looking for new ideas. If you have topics for the show you'd like to have, again, reach out to me, Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com, wildlife control consultant at gmail.com. And again, I'm not spamming people. I don't put out a broadcast newsletter. So you're not going to be, I'm not selling your information. So anyways, but that's something for you to think about as well. So let me pull up my PowerPoint here and kind of get that started. So let's get going on this. So I need to kind of move this down because this is obviously information that you've already seen before. And there we go. Let's get started there. So there's our roof rats, of course, scientific name, Rattus. If you're looking for some of the biological information, just get to my previous vodcast. Again, I publish, for those of you that are new, if you're just coming on board, I publish about once a week. And so I try to keep a list updated on my website if you're looking for perhaps a topic that I've covered. I've been doing this for, guess it's been 4 years yet, so certainly probably close to 4 years. So there's a lot of information out there, and I'm really loath to overlap myself too much, but I may need to go back and revisit some other earlier topics and kind of update them, because the industry changes, not radically, but certainly there's some advances within our industry, to be sure. So when we're dealing with control, I follow Dr. Scott Hygnstrom's organizational model, and his organizational model of control method starts with habitat modification, frightening devices, and by habitat modification we also include exclusion in there. So habitat modification, frightening devices, repellents, toxicants, shooting, trapping, biological controls. So that's generally how he organizes his material. He may move toxicants to a different part of that schema. But the point is by those headings, you essentially cover every possible method to control a vertebrate species. And it can also be useful, in my opinion, for insects and other types of pests. However, this particular schema is a mental checklist that certainly I use when someone calls me up and asks me, how do I deal with X? What are my options? So you basically go down the list. Now you may, and I suspect if you've been in the business for any length of time, you go through this mental checklist as well. You just may not be doing it consciously. I would like you to be thinking about doing it consciously. So let's go down that list again. Habitat modification, which includes exclusion, frightening devices, repellents, toxicants, shooting, trapping, biological controls. That's it. One of those things is going to be what those cover all of your options. Of course, traps, if you're dealing with cage traps, box traps, restraining traps, lethal traps, right? So you have a lot of different subcategories. Same way with frightening devices. Frightening devices. Is it a visual frightening device? Is it an audible frightening device? Is it an audible visual frightening device? Is it a biological frightening device? So you have different subcategories. But when you think about things in those categories, it helps you sort of put everything into perspective, and you just simply work down the list. And always remember, when we're dealing with wildlife and vertebrate pest control, don't think of things in terms of a silver bullet. Always think about it. It's not just an either or. It's not habitat modification or trapping. No. That's not the way to think about it. It's habitat modification and something else. Don't be afraid to mix and match these options. In fact, there's sometimes a synergism. With synergism is just a fancy word meaning that when you get so much control using one method and so much control using the other method, but when you combine the two methods, often you get a multiplier effect. So let's say this method is 20% effective and this other method is 20% effective. Well, if you added them together, you're only getting 40% efficacy. But when you think about by combining them together in vertebrate control, it often becomes a multiplier, so that maybe you'd get an effective 60% control. So over and above, because you're not adding, you're multiplying, because habitat modification multiplies other types of methods that you're using. All right, so that's probably a presentation for another time, but I want to be sure I emphasize that, because I think sometimes we need to always go back to the fundamentals of wildlife control, because this isn't rocket science. To be fair, this is not rocket science, but we got to be careful that we're not skipping the steps and that we're not realizing that there's really no silver bullets in this industry, as much as we'd love to find some, right? Because it would really increase our profitability. But we need to recognize
Make sure you think about all the various methods and incorporate them to the extent practical for your situation, because every situation is unique in how you're applying some of these tools. All right, so when we're dealing with roof rats, can't avoid habitat modification. Now, I know a lot of us in our business recognize that habitat modification often gets short shrift. Why? Because your clients won't do it. I totally understand that. But you need to be sure you emphasize this with your client, the importance of habitat modification, that if they don't do it, it's costing them money. And you need to recognize that the efficacy of the other techniques that we're talking about often hinges upon whether, to the extent that habitat modification has been performed. For example, if there is a ton of food out there for the roof rats, why are they going to be interested in the particular bait you're using, whether it's for a trap or whether it's with a rodenticide? If they have all this additional food available, why would they bother? It's like, why would I do that? Right? So that is something that you need to be sure you're using as part of your pricing model as well. When you have clients that aren't listening to you and they're not performing some of the habitat modification, you need to be sure you're charging appropriately, because you know they're going to be yelling at you, oh, this guy is stupid, he doesn't know what he's doing, the products he's not really a professional. You know, you get this criticism, and it's just not fair to you. Now, I would also encourage you, as part of your business, to do some of the habitat modification, charge the client for it. Say, hey, I'm happy to do some of this habitat modification for you. Here's the price. Here's what it will do. Okay, so something definitely for you to think about. So with roof rats, you want to think about cleaning up fruit and, if necessary, trimming things back. There should be no branches leaning over the house, providing an easy access for roof rats. You've got to be careful of the wall ivy. That just makes it easier for these roof rats to climb the structure itself. Okay, so you want to try to eliminate all that to the extent possible and practical. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Just because you can't do it all doesn't mean you shouldn't do any of it. That's what happens. A lot of people, oh, I can't make it perfect, so why bother? No. Do what you can, because you may be able to funnel the roof rats to areas that are going to be easier for you to control, perhaps using more blind sets where there's no bait at all required. Why? Because you were able to narrow the places that roof rat can use to get to the structure. Things to think about, to be sure. Exclusion. If you have a choice between lethal control and exclusion, if you have to make that type of choice, and I trust that you won't have to, always spend more time on exclusion. Or maybe I should phrase it this way, not so much lethal control, but if you have a choice between habitat modification and hardening that structure, hardening the structure gives you a bigger bang for your buck, or your client's dollar, depending on how it works, right? You still want to do habitat modification, but if the client says I can do A and I can do B, then you'd always want to emphasize hardening the structure to keep the roof rat out. Copper stuff that you're not using, professionals aren't going to be using. Steel wool, right? Steel wool's going to rust out. Excluder fabric. And again, you're going to use a sealant with these particular products. Any gaps, half-inch, little indigestion, half-inch or larger need to be secured. Now be careful here. You want to make sure that those openings are not actively being used. And if you are securing an opening that is actively being used by a rat, you have to ask yourself the question, how confident am I about some of my lethal control methods inside the structure and outside the structure, because the rodents may be damaging part of the structure to get out or to get in. So think about that before you just willy-nilly secure openings that you come across. Right? So this is the balancing act. This is what will make this a little more time consuming, because you've got to make some judgments. Now, how do you determine whether an opening is being used actively or not? My method was simply using some corked newspaper. I would take some newspaper, roll it up, and then just cork the hole. And if the hole was not being disturbed, because a rat can just simply chew through that newspaper or push that newspaper right out of the way, or a squirrel, that way they're not trashing excuse me, the house. And you can tell whether there's any movement in or out. Excuse me. Oh, sorry about that. So you want to be sure that opening is not being used actively on the part of the rodent. And if it is, and you're saying, you know what, I don't care, you need to have a plan to be sure your client understands that there could be an incident, but if you have to be confident you have enough rodent control on the exterior, on the interior, to capture or control that animal before he does any damage to the structure itself. Beware. Be cautious here, because animals will do things that you didn't anticipate. It's a thinking thing, so be sure you understand the risk that you're taking. But sometimes you may feel that you need to do that for whatever reason. Maybe you're under time restriction. You've got to work that out. Make sure your client understands and get that all in writing so your client signs off on it. How about wire walkers? Okay, I love wire walkers. I think they're really cool, but particularly with animals able to walk wires. Well, how do you stop them from doing that? Here's a product from Critter Guard. This is known as the line guard that they have. I'm going to bring you over to their website here in a moment. And so let me pull that up for you. So this is Critter Guard. It is a corporation that produces a product that's used on power lines. Now, let me be careful about this. You are not to be installing anything on a power line, okay? That'll get you killed faster than you want to realize, or really injure you. I just want to make you aware of this particular product and discuss this with the manufacturer. My understanding is a lot of electrical companies will install these types of products for you, I guess, but they're not going to buy it for you. So you can encourage the client to purchase the product, have the electrical company install it or turn off the electricity, whatever the case may be. You need to be sure that you are very, very safe in and around power lines. Okay, this can kill you. All right, but I want you to be aware that this product exists. So let's take a look at some of their solutions. Here's their line guard. Here's their pole guard. Let me open that up for you. That also prevents animals from climbing up and down poles. Okay, and so these spin, which is pretty impressive. And then in terms of their line guard, let me go back to their line guard. These spin as well. So if an animal tries to, they have to jump over it, and if they land on one of these discs, the disc spins and they fall off. And so quite impressive of a device. Not cheap, but certainly something that you can discuss with your client, particularly if you have rats accessing structure through power lines. Now, can it be used on non-electrical lines? I believe that it can. And so again, this is something you want to discuss. Am I making any money off this? The answer is no. I'm just making you aware of it because I think it's a neat little tool. Would love to get feedback from those of you that have used it into the field. It's kind of an impressive little device in my opinion, but I'd love to get your comments on it. Yay or nay for those of you out there looking to use it. So there is your line guard. So that's an earlier version of their pole guard. Obviously, this is not going to stop any rat. Of course, they can hang 10 over that, no problem. But it may stop other animals that are climbing. So it's for another version. Perhaps maybe some animals can't make that kind of a turn that are climbing the pole as well. Something for you to consider about. How about flashing? Is there a way to stop rats from climbing the side of a building or perhaps climbing a tree? And the answer is yes, because they can't grip the smoothness of aluminum flashing. Just be sure that the width of that is at least 18 inches, and you want to be sure it's high enough on the pole that the rat is not able to jump it. So you need to be sure that the rat has to commit to the tree or to the pole and then try to reach up and climb. So 18 to 24 inches wide, and it can be a way to stop even squirrels and other animals. Just be sure if you're putting it on a tree, you'd want to make sure that you have it it loose enough so that as the tree grows, it'll expand, that the flashing will push out with it. And because fungus can grow in between the flashing and the tree bark, harming the tree, you may want to put little shivs in between the flashing and the tree. It needs to be quite narrow, maybe 1/4 of an inch, so that way that there's a little bit of air breathing there to let things dry out. I certainly would want to use something that wouldn't be porous, like wood. Probably something maybe more plastic, to be sure there's a little bit of air breathing underneath there so it doesn't create the fungus and help kill the tree that way. Traps, of course, are very good. What kind of traps do you want to use? You always want to be looking at expanded trigger traps if you have an option. And notice how this is baited. I know I was baiting traps wrong for a long period of time. You'd want to just get that bait in that little cup there. Why? Because it forces the rodent to fully commit into the kill zone of that snap trap. If you're smearing it all over the plastic there, the rodent may not be fully committed into the kill zone, and then you're going to get a misfire. The other thing you want to be sure that you're doing, and that is you want to modify your rat traps. If you're using these wooden-based rat traps, notice how the trap on the right, let me see if I can put my cursor there for you. Yep, there it is. Notice how I have a washer under these base tines right here. And the reason for that is because that will make sure that the spring tension is at its tightest extent. So that way, when you're setting that trap, you have full spring power, because as the more that those tines embed into the wood, you're loosening the tension on the spring. You want that rat trap to have full power, so when that striker bar is whirling across toward the animal's neck and chest, you want that to come with full power. Rats are strong. When I trapped one Norway, it hit him, and he was able to extricate himself from the trap, because when I found him, he wasn't in the trap anymore. So, and I saw a video, there's a video on YouTube where a rat gets hit by a trap, one of these snap traps, and he basically bench presses it off his body and gets out. You don't want that to happen. So these are great traps. I'm not trying to trash the trap here. What I'm saying is, if you have these wooden-based traps, just be sure to put a little modification on them. And again, this isn't my idea. I got this off the web, but it's really intriguing here. We just put a little piece of metal underneath those base tines to make sure you have a little bit of tension on that spring, so you get all the power for that striker bar to be sure that rat is getting a good hit. And when you are trapping, elevate your traps to the extent that you can. Try not to trap roof rats on the ground. Roof rats like to climb, and they love climbing, and they want to be in trees, and they like to be under cover. So to the extent possible, secure your traps. You put them in trees or in elevated areas. Now, the picture I have here is not the ideal trap set, and I'm not suggesting it is. It's just sort of an illustration of making sure your traps are off the ground, get them off the ground. The problem with this particular setup is that it's vulnerable. It makes birds vulnerable who may be attracted to the peanut butter that's on the trigger. So I would suggest, if you're doing this, you want your traps under some sort of cover, and there are different designs out there. Try some of them out. Reach back out to me. Tell me, hey, I've used this particular setup. Maybe there's some bait boxes that you're able to use and tie them to branches and onto trees to get rodents, encouraging them to get off the ground and up into those bait stations. The beauty of doing elevated traps is that it also reduces some non-target captures as well. Toxicants. What's the best toxicant? Well, there's no real specific roof rat based toxicant. Okay, let's be frank about that. However, Brodifacoum, surprise, surprise, it shouldn't be for those of you that know anything about rodenticides. Brodifacoum is incredibly toxic. So it's a second-gen rodenticide. It has the highest efficacy. Why? Because it is extraordinarily toxic. Okay. It should not be your first choice. However, I would certainly encourage it. Of course, California is beginning to think about restricting a lot of these second gens, and there may be more to come. I'm not an expert on California law, but there's certainly been some changes over there. But you shouldn't be using Modification right off the bat, unless you have a situation where you're competing with a lot of alternative food sources. Then I would suggest probably doing Modification right off the bat. Of course, follow the label, follow the label, follow the label. If you're looking for a good first generation anticoagulant to sort of reduce some of those secondary hazards, it's not going to eliminate them, it's going to reduce them, then difascinone is certainly something you'd want to consider as your first gen. And so don't just simply think, oh, first gens are not as effective as second gens. It's not necessarily true. They're a lot less toxic. They do require a multiple feed. However, as I've said in a previous podcast, those first gens, they are more toxic with a little bit each dose. So when an animal gets that second dose, these are incredibly toxic products because they work better a little bit at a time rather than at a full dose. The problem with second gens, of course, is the rodents getting 2 to 3 to 4 times the amount they need to die. And so they basically become this walking toxic bomb. That's how I call it. Bomb is a little bit dramatic, of course. They're not bombs. But they have a lot more rodenticide in them than what they needed to kill them. And that is a problem. This is where the secondary poisoning issue really becomes an issue. Get those bait stations elevated. This picture is from one bait station that uses magnets to allow you to place it against metal, and that allows you, of course, to elevate the bait station while still having something that is secure so that kids can't pick it up and that sort of thing. So you can check out that as well. This is an interesting little product here, and I shouldn't say product, but a modification of a bait station. This is using a Protecta from Bell Labs. And it's an article from 1990 by Erickson et al. Whenever you see the phrase et al., it means there were other authors here as well. And the title of this article was A Roof Rat Bait Station That Excludes Deer Mice, published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, Volume 18, pages 319 to 325. And so if you're able to see the photograph and diagram here, what it is, it's a protective bait station elevated with a 7.6 centimeter PVC pipe. And so the benefit of elevating that bait station, so what they did is they took a PVC pipe. Now, a centimeter is about 2 centimeters or so, 2.5 centimeters makes an inch. Okay, give or take. So when you have a 7.6 inch, it's probably a 3-inch, probably a 3-inch wide PVC pipe. And they basically drilled a hole in the bottom of the bait station, inserted this pipe up inside the bait station, and the pipe is 70 inches, actually over 70 inches long. It's actually 80 inches long because 10 inches, not 80 inches, sorry. It's 80 centimeters long. 10 centimeters is inside the bait station, 25 centimeters is in the ground, and then 45 centimeters from the ground to the base of the bait station, okay? And then what they did was they cut 2 5-centimeter holes, one at the bottom of the pipe that would be just at the surface of the ground, and then another one at the portion of the pipe that was inside the bait station itself. And so what the idea is that the rat enters the pipe and then sort of Santa Clauses up inside, shimmies up inside the pipe into the bait station that's elevated, feeds on the rodenticide, and then leaves. You may say, well, how does that stop a deer mice? Well, the problem is that the pipe is too wide for the deer mouse to shimmy up the inside. So most bait stations, when we use them, they're wonderful devices, but they're only designed to exclude animals that are larger than the target animal. They do a very poor job of protecting the bait from animals that are smaller than the target animal, which makes sense. I mean, a hole that's 3 inches wide allows animals that are less than 3 inches to enter. So how do we modify our bait station to allow the animal that we want, but still exclude smaller animals? Well, in this case, they were concerned about the deer mouse on this particular island, but they wanted to kill the roof rats. And this is what they used, was an elevated bait station. So, Stephen, I'm not doing all that work. And I understand there's going to be some effort here, but this is where I think you can separate yourself from just the ordinary pest control operator or the pest management professional or the wildlife control operator. We have got to find an edge against other companies. And one of the ways is by marketing with people and saying, look, I can use products that are targeting your animal and therefore have less secondary poisoning risk. Why? Because I'm not going to be killing mice. But you know, and I know, that when you put a bait station on the ground for rats, you know that, and you have trying to control rats, you're going to be killing a lot of other animals that aren't necessarily part of your target things. Like, you may say, well, I don't care if voles die. Well, that may be true, and I can appreciate that. But if the client hasn't hired you to control voles, how is that helping you financially? How is that helping the environment? Or if the client hasn't helped you wanted you to control deer mice, how is it helpful for you to be poisoning those? Do you see how it also cuts both ways? You may not care, but your client may care. And I'm arguing that even you should care, because there's a financial incentive for you to reduce the amount of rodenticides that you're using and to make sure that you're targeting the animal that you want to kill with the rodenticide. Something for you to consider. Again, I'm just giving you this idea. It's a clever thing, and I think this would be really cool to use. Could some of you use steel pipes? Yeah, probably. Don't know, maybe a little bit more durable, maybe easier to install in the ground, but certainly something for you to think about. Well, what about traps? Well, roof rat traps can be we use these on pocket gophers. Sometimes they can be used on ground squirrels, but the DK2 is certainly one. I think that's called the black hole on the left. These can be baited, used to capture roof rats. You can wire them to branches and elevate them and that sort of thing. Just make sure you're following the trapping laws in your state. Some of these body gripping traps are not legal in various states. Unfortunately, why? Because the animal rights protest industry is continuing to gain ground. Unfortunately, our industry has done a rather poor job of getting the word out and also pushing back against the animal rights protest industry. And to be fair, part of that is because there's a lot of apathy among wildlife control operators and pest control professionals, because they're, to be frank, sometimes there's a little bit too much interest in making money in the short term rather than thinking about the long-term health of the industry. But so it goes. And enough about that. Baits that you can use, of course, never rely on a bait to overcome a bad location, right? So make sure you're putting these traps in places where roof rats are in close proximity. So raisins, prunes, peanut butter, but do watch out for allergies. Of course, nut butter, do watch out for allergies, and things like gumdrops. So roof rats like things that are sweet, okay? And they like fruit as well. All right, well, that's enough for today. I'm Stephen Vantassel, wildlife control consultant. You've been listening to another podcast of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Again, would love to get some feedback from you. If you have any, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Hope you've enjoyed this little chat about this little survey of control methods for control of roof rats. You may say, well, Stephen, you didn't cover any frightening devices and you didn't cover any repellents. That's because I don't think there's really any products out there that are really worth their salt right now. But if you disagree, if you're a manufacturer of some of these products, I would love to hear from you. Again, I don't make any money off of the products that have been listed there before, other than my book, of course, which is pictured right there. I do make money on my own book of course. But again, I'd love to hear from you. Do take a few moments, subscribe to our channel, and also visit us, of course, on Facebook. We'd love to have you as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Ideas for new shows, definitely reach out. Otherwise, I'm going to keep talking about what interests me and what I come across. Again, this is Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. So why do we call it Living the Wildlife? We call it Living the Wildlife because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.